This is Sentience and Sapience, the place of enactive cognitive science in Sellarsian philosophy of mind. All right. So it's become something, I think, of an orthodoxy amongst philosophers working in the Sellarsian tradition, particularly Brandom and McDowell in particular, that there's some really important distinction to be drawn between sentience and sapience. And I'm taking sapience as our ability to make assertions and other normatively governed speech acts with an inferentially articulable propositional content. By contrast, sentience concerns our ability to discriminate perceptually between motivationally salient stimuli and to act in correspondingly appropriate ways. Now, at least in Sellars himself, I take it that sentience and sapience are both transcendental notions in the following sense of transcendental. Namely, that these concepts are grounded in an inventory of the most general kinds of cognitive capacities and incapacities necessary for the kind of cognitively significant experiences that we can recognize as being experiences, including but not limited to knowledge. And so any being that we could recognize as having cognitive experiences like the kinds that we have are going to be a being that has is both sentient and sapient. However, I also think that Sellars should be read as having as a kind of methodological principle, as De Vries puts it, quote, transcendental structures must be realized in causal structures, unquote. And I take it that's more or less equivalent with what O'Shea calls the norm-nature-meta principle. So I take it then that whatever structures or processes that we posit in transcendental inquiry must be somehow correlated with structures and processes that are empirically confirmed and, to extent possible, consistent with a scientific view of the world, however broadly conceived. That's a very rough sketch of the sort of Sellarsian framework, and I accept that, of course. Why else would I be here? But within this framework, I aim to criticize one small aspect of how Sellars conceives of sentience. Now, Sellars maintains that perceptual experience involves both conceptual and non-conceptual content, where the conceptual content is explicated in terms of the theory of meanings as functional classifications, and for Sellars, where non-conceptual content is explicated in terms of sense impressions or sensations as causally mediating our perceptual encounters with objects. What I want to argue now is that there's a problem with the commitment to sense impressions. I want to argue that while Sellars was right to say that what we need to posit sheer receptivity in our transcendental inquiry, but that he was mistaken to think that sense impressions are the best candidates for causally implementing sheer receptivity. Instead, I want to argue that if we look at recent work in the enactive approach in cognitive science, we can see that sensor motor abilities actually are actually more promising candidate. And so then I'll conclude by trying to show what happens if we sort of plug enactive cognitive science into that place within a roughly Sellarsian framework. But first I want to sort of try and unpack a little bit about how Sellars himself understands concepts and sense impressions as sort of fitting together. And to do that, I'm going to turn now to a late essay of his, The Role of Imagination in Kant's Theory of Experience. And in particular, I want to sort of try and understand a bit better how Sellars conceives of the productive imagination as getting sensations and concepts to line up, to work together. Now, as Sellars sets up the exposition of visual perception, and already we might just have a little bit of a worry that, I'm trying to understand perception as such in terms of vision per se might itself be a little bit problematic. But as he sets it up, he draws our attention to the fact that our visual experience immediately appears to us as experience of objects, even though three-dimensional entities, they have in space and time, causally interacting, so on and so forth, even though what we immediately see of those objects is their facing sides. So how then do we experience the interiors and non-facing sides of objects that we're not immediately confronted with? Well, one answer that Sellars quickly considers and then rejects is the thought that unseen interiors or non-facing sides are merely believed in, just as we might believe in any other non-existent object, like a golden mountain. This response, Sellars notes, simply does not do justice to the phenomenology of visual experience. To use Sellars' own example of the apple, when we see a red apple, we see it as containing a volume of white and as juicy and cool, even though the whiteness, juiciness, and coolness are not seen of the apple. All we see of the apple is the red-facing side. As Sellars puts it, quote, "An actual coolness is bodily present in the experience as is an actual volume of white," unquote. Now this in turn raises the further question as to how that particular red-facing surface of the apple is seen as the red-facing surface of an apple, since an apple is a physical object and not a facing surface. Now, since the interior whiteness and other current sensible properties are not merely believed in, and they are not what is immediately seen of the apple, what is their mode of presentation in visual and perceptual consciousness? Sellars' answer is that they are present by virtue of being imagined. Concepts, of course, are also at work, since the applehood of the apple is neither sensed nor imaged, nor but conceived of. And so Sellars remarks, quote, "Roughly, imagining is an intimate blend of imaging and conceptualization, whereas perceiving is an intimate blend of sensing and imaging and conceptualization," unquote. So to perceive an apple as an apple is to be perceptually aware simultaneously of what is sensed, the red-facing surface, what is imaged, the white interior, the red non-facing surface, the juiciness and coolness. I think couth is the word he uses. And also, of course, what is conceptualized, the apple qua physical object with causal and motor properties. And the synthesis of these three acts requires what Sellars here, following Kant, calls the productive imagination. Now, what exactly does the productive imagination do for us? It involves, quote, "the constructing of sense-image models of external objects," unquote. Now, two important features of image models must be stressed. Firstly, the image model of an object is perspectival, whereas, of course, the concept of the object is not. Secondly, the construction of an image model necessarily involves, as well, the construction of the image model of the perceiver's own body. Now, there's nothing essentially perspectival about the concept of a dog, but the image model of a dog, whether imaged or imagined or perceived, is necessarily that of a dog as seen from a particular point of view, indexed to the position of the perceiver's body in relation to the dog as imagined, since, quote, "the construction is a unified process guided by combination of sensory input on the one hand and background beliefs, memories, and expectations on the other," unquote. We should say that the role of sensory input, whether retinal stimulations or other sensory receptors, that role is to guide and constrain the construction of image models. The image model of the perceiver's body and the image models of the perceptual objects together transform the array of sense impressions into perspectives of perspectives on some three-dimensional object in space and time. This is not just to say that we always perceive from some particular perspective, but we always perceive from some perspective by virtue of how the productive imagination simultaneously constructs the image model of the perceiver's own body together with the image model of the perceptual object. Now, in this way, Sellars seems quite able to account for the role of embodiment in perception. and thereby seems to establish the intimate relationship between action and perception that's long been thinked by pragmatists, as Sellars himself notes. In other words, action is at work in perception by virtue of the relations between the perceiving subject and perceived object captured by the respective image models of the perceiver's body and of the object as perceived. That much, then, is sort of the Sellarsian story as I understand it. But I also think that we should also notice that there's a bit of a cost in Sellars' account of embodiment here. And because on Sellars' account, veridical perception requires that the productive imagination is guided by sensations. And I think it follows from this that the productive imagination then more or less functions identically in perception and imagination in the narrow sense, as when I dream, hallucinate, or deliberately construct a mental image. The difference is that in veridical perception, the construction of image models, both of the object and of my body, is guided by sensory input. Whereas in non-veridical perception, it's not guided by any input. It's not guided by any worldly inputs. But I take it then that as a result, our very embodiment is, in this weird way, sort of neutral with regard to whether perception is veridical or not. The image model of my own body is constructed by my productive imagination, whether constrained by sensory inputs or not. It's my body is present in perceptual consciousness as imagined. And the sensory input is in a very curious way sort of disembodied then, or at any rate not as fully embodied as senses are in, say, earlier American pragmatists such as John Dewey, and as well as within certain figures in the phenomenological tradition such as Merleau-Ponty. So now I want to understand a bit more why exactly sense impressions get introduced the way that they do. And I take it, and so again, returning to this sort of general thought, right, that transcendental structures must be realized in causal structures, I now want to distinguish between two different parts of the story. Right, there's the project of reflecting on the necessity of some external constraint on perception, and then there's the project of giving some specific account of the causal items that play that constraining role. Now, to identify the necessity of constraint, Sellars introduces the concept of sheer receptivity in science and metaphysics, whereas Sellars thinks that sense impressions are sort of the right causal items to play this constraining role. So we have a transcendental reflection on our cognitive activity, which shows that empirical content as such requires that agents be sentient as well as sapient. But we also need to have some sort of scientific or quasi-scientific account of sense impressions in order to sort of specify what items, how the right sort of causal powers to play this, to do this. And so let me sort of unpack this a bit more carefully and sort of slow down a little bit. I'm a bit nervous. Right. I don't know why, but anyway. So, the transcendental reflection that motivates the concept of sheer receptivity takes place in science metaphysics through Sellars' interpretation of the Kantian distinction between intuitions and concepts. Now here, Sellars argues that in addition to intuitive conceptual representations, that is, conceptual representations of particulars or individuals, which are modeled off of complex demonstrative phrases, there's a different sense of intuition in the receptivity of the senses, which must be non-conceptual in order to play the requisite role of guiding thoughts. The productive imagination, the understanding, insofar as it is playing the role of guiding sensibility, produces this white cube, an intuition, modeled off of this cube is white, a judgment. But if intuitions, in one of their roles, are already informed by the deployment of concepts, then we need an account of receptivity proper to explain how our beliefs and judgments are answerable to a world that we do not create but discover. At this point, Sellars thinks that there is an ambiguity in Kant's own concept of intuition. And we need to resolve this ambiguity both to understand what Kant should have said, as well as understanding why so many philosophers after Kant sort of got on the wrong track. Right? And so, for example, Sellars says, this is from Science Metaphysics, page 16, "Indeed, it is only if Kant distinguishes the radically non-conceptual character of sense from the conceptual character of the synthesis of apprehension and intuition, and accordingly the receptivity of sense from the guidance of intuition, only if he can do that, can he avoid the dialectic which leads from Hegel's phenomenology to 19th century idealism." Right. Notice, I think, that he seems to think Hegel's phenomenology, okay, that's all right. It's after that things go off the rails. And much more seriously, on page 29, Kant's failure to distinguish between the forms of receptivity proper and the forms of that which is represented by the intuitive conceptual representation, which is guided by receptivity, a distinction demanded both by the thrust of his argument and by sound philosophy, had as its consequence that no sooner had he left the scene, these particular waters were muddled by Hegel and the mills, and philosophy had to begin the slow climb back to Kant, which is still underway. So, and I think that this much seems quite right. We must have some way of distinguishing between the receptivity of sense, or sheer receptivity, as he puts it, and the guidance of intuitions. But this requires, of course, that intuitive conceptual representations are guided by receptivity proper. When I perceptually take in how things are, my productive imagination organizes perceptual experience so that I'm suitably disposed to make a claim about what I perceive. And this can be the case only if my sensory receptivity to the world has just enough structure to it for it to guide the productive imagination. Receptivity proper must have, Sellars concludes, representational purport in order for it to guide the productive imagination's deployment of concepts. And so, in order to understand what this must be, Sellars says, well, there have to be radically non-conceptual representations. They have to be representations in order for them to have the right sort of structure for guiding intuition, but they have to be non-conceptual in order to be able to constrain the deployment of concepts. And so this is why Sellars introduces sensations as playing a causal role. As he puts it in EPM, quote, neither epistemic nor physical, unquote. They are causally efficacious states of non-apperceptive consciousness which constrain the activity of the productive imagination. So, sense impressions then turn on a methodological principle as well as transcendental result. Right? It's a methodological principle that all transcendental structures must be realized in causal structures. It's a transcendental result that sheer receptivity is a transcendental structure. So, there must be some causal structure in which sheer receptivity is reflected. And sense impressions, as causally efficacious episodes of consciousness, seem to Sellars to be the right causal structures for reflecting the transcendental structure of sheer receptivity. But it's one thing, of course, to think that there's this transcendentally justified commitment to sheer receptivity, and to try and locate the right causal structures implementing that role. That's fine by my lights. It's quite another to think that sense impressions are the best candidates for doing just that. So what I'll do now is consider an alternative candidate for this role of causally implementing sheer receptivity. In particular, I want to argue that lived embodiment per se, not sense impressions, is in many ways a better candidate for playing this role. Now, one ready reply is that lived embodiment precisely because of its intimate link with action, simply lacks the right kind of passivity to play the role of sheer receptivity. That's a criticism that Bill's given me many times over the years. But it's precisely here that I want to pose a bit of a challenge to Sellars' residual empiricism. Because I think it's an empiricist conviction, retained by Kant, and also, I think, by Sellars, that only that which is passive can count as genuinely receptive. But I don't think that need to be the case. Instead, on the contrary, I find myself in basic agreement with Kukla and Lance when they write, quote, "Receptivity should not be equated with passivity. My encounter with objects is receptive, not to the extent that I play a passive role in this encounter, but instead to the extent that I find or discover them to be a certain way in a direct encounter with them," unquote. That's from their Receptivity and Intersubjective Experience, the Super Squirrel paper. So what I want you to do now is understand how sheer receptivity, thus understood, is causally realized. And to do that, I now want to turn to a relatively new development in philosophy of cognitive science, a research program called Enactivism, in order to suggest that sheer receptivity is causally realized, not by sensations, but by the sensor-motor skills of the living organism. Okay, so now I want to turn to enactive cognitive science. So in recent years, the major debate within cognitive science has been between symbolic or computational models of the mind and connectionist models of the mind. But more recently, this debate has been contested by the rise of enactivism. The term, the enactive approach, was coined by Francisca Varela in The Embodied Mind by Varela, Thompson, Roche, 1991, which contrasts with computationalism and connectionism by focusing on cognition as an ongoing process that links animals with their environments, rather than as an activity that transpires entirely or mostly within brains. Accordingly, Mark Rowlands refers to both computationalism and connectionism as Cartesian cognitive science, in contrast with the focus on 4E cognitive science, mind as embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. And this enactive approach has further been developed by Alvin Noe, Evan Thompson, and Tony Chimero. As Evan Thompson puts it, the key question here lies in the best models for thinking about mindedness. Whereas computationalism treats the mind as a digital computer and connectionism treats the mind as a neural network, enactivism treats the mind as an embodied dynamical system, such that, quote, "cognitive processes emerge from the nonlinear and circular causality of continuous sensor-motor interactions involving the brain, body, and environment." Alvin Noe fleshes this out a bit more by emphasizing the role of sensor-motor skills in organizing perceptual experience. Quote, "Intuitions as patterns of stimulation without knowledge of the sensor-motor significance of these intuitions is blind. Crucially, the knowledge in question is practical knowledge. It is know-how. To perceive, you must be in possession of sensor-motor bodily skills." So contra Sellars, on Noe's view, it's not the productive imagination which imbues sensations with cognitive significance and thereby constitutes perceptual experience. Rather, it is the sensor-motor skills of a living animal which play this role, crucial to which is coming to understand the ways in which one's sensations co-vary or would co-vary with one's actual or possible movements. On this basis, Noe gives a different account of the problem of perceptual presence. How are the unperceived properties of perceived objects given to us or present to us? So whereas Sellars argues that the unperceived properties are bodily present by virtue of being imagined, Noe suggests that they are bodily present by virtue of the accumulated store of implicit know-how of sensor-motor contingencies. And this bodily know-how allows us to perceive the red apple as containing a volume of white that is juicy and cool, because that is how we would sense it if we were to cut it open or take a bite out of it. It's the relevant sensory-motor skills that allow us to perceive the interior whiteness, not the productive imagination. Although Sellars clearly notes the role of the body image in constructing the relevant image models, Noe proposes a much more intimate coordination of sensing and moving. The relevant body skills are sensor-motor. They are not mere sensations that have to first be taken up and then synthesized in accordance with the concept of the perceiver's body and the concept of the object. In short, Sellars' model is, I want to say, a top-down model. The concepts determine how the sensations are synthesized, whereas Noe's model is a bottom-up model, according to which sensor-motor skills constitute perceptual intelligibility independent of the understanding, or at least independent understanding if the understanding is the capacity to apply concepts as predicates of possible judgments. In short, the enactive approach shares with Merleau-Ponty the emphasis that to perceive is not to judge. Now I want to make two further points about the enactive approach to cognitive science. So firstly, the enactive approach has close parallels with the ecological psychology developed from Gibson, and this parallel is indeed stressed by both Noe and Chimero. Now, one important implication of this parallel is that, according to enactivism, what an animal directly perceives are what Gibson calls affordances. Right, the possibilities of movement as strongly coupled with possibilities of sensing. Thus, enactivism is consistent with direct perceptual realism, but it's not direct realism about objects that are determined independently of any cognitive agent. It's a direct perceptual realism of affordances. Secondly, enactivism is justified, to the extent that it is, by experiments in psychology and neuroscience and perception. Although enactivism looks to phenomenology for inspiration, it's not just phenomenology. We should take enactive cognitive science seriously, to the extent that we should, if it gives us empirically confirmed causal explanations of perceptual phenomena, not just because it doesn't turn on correct subjective descriptions of perceptual phenomena. And it's because it gives us empirically confirmed causal explanations, that's why sensor-motor skills are the right kind of concept for causally implementing sheer receptivity. Okay. On my view, then, sensor-motor skills causally implement sheer receptivity by virtue of constraining the higher-order discursive activity that underpins distinctively propositional thought. And yet, that's all Sellars really needs. Receptivity proper, in the sense that contrasts with spontaneity, assumes, with Kant, that spontaneity characterizes the understanding, which in turn is paradigmatically bound up with judgment and with concepts as predicates of possible judgment. But nothing in that conception of spontaneity, which gives receptivity its sense by way of contrast, requires that receptivity be devoid of activity of its own distinctive kind. Indeed, nothing would be essentially lost in Sellars even if, as Noe himself argues, sensor-motor skills are themselves conceptual. All that we would need is a distinction between two different kinds of concepts. Those that are at work in the deployment of sensor-motor skills, and those that are at work in propositional content available as non-inferential. This is why handouts are a good thing. Those that work in propositional content available as non-inferential content suitable for premises and inferences in your language entry transitions, or as conclusions of practical inferences in the language exit transitions. In other words, all we need, or all Sellars requires here, is to say, well, look, we have the sensor-motor skills. That's the sheer receptivity. That causally implements sheer receptivity, and that constrains the deployment of propositional contents in both the language entry and language exit transitions. Now, my aim here is not to reject the account of discursive content as inferentially structured. Rather, my aim here is to supplement an inferentialist approach to sapience with an enactivist account about sentience. And I think doing this has some significant advantages. For one thing, it suggests, I think, a response to Stephen Turner's objections to Brandom. Right? Turner objects to Brandom's account of Brandom's account of normativity because Turner thinks Brandom's account of normativity is just not compatible with what we know about how the brain works. But I think that Turner's own account of how the brain works is based on connectionism, and that's itself, from an enactivist point of view, deeply mired in Cartesian assumptions, precisely because the connectionist account of mindedness neglects the structural coupling between sensor motor abilities and environmental affordances as constituting cognitive processes. On an activist conception of mind, at least some cognitive processes are partially constituted by embodiment, environment, or both. So far from being an obstacle to a Brandomian account of higher-order propositional thought, an enactivist conception of bodily intentionality can serve as a naturalistic starting point for the emergence of norms in the demanding sense, in part because we can think of bodily intentionality as being the kind of intentionality that hominoids generally have. Normative practices emerge when individual bodily intentionality, as explained by enactive cognitive science, undergoes the two steps suggested by Tomasello's recent theory of the evolution of normativity. It requires that intentionality be sort of brought together in what he calls joint intentionality, where two individual cognitive agents are able to link up their intentional activities, and there's a further step where collective intentionality emerges. And if we think in this way about using Tomasello's recent work together with what Noe and Thompson have done to sort of think about how bodily intentionality as sort of how sentience plays out can be sort of collectivized, I guess is the best term I can think of here, then we actually have some way in which we can see here how normative practices can be seen to be a lot less mysterious and magical in the order of nature, which exactly was Turner's worry. Now, in thinking of sensor-motor skills rather than sensations per se as causally instantiating sheer subjectivity, we're led, I think, to a new conception of the relationship between sentience and sapience. Right? Inferentialism explains propositional content primarily in terms of its role in inference rather than its role in representation. Right? It is in some sense an anti-representationalist theory of propositional content, although it does explain our use of the term representation. Similarly, enactivism, particularly in the version developed by Tony Chimero, is emphatically and explicitly anti-representationalist at the level of subpersonal explanations. So what I want to suggest now is that if we take inferentialism about propositional content and enactivism about perceptual content, and sort of bring them together, we have a view that is in some sense sort of the evil twin to Hugh Price's new bifurcation thesis, with its distinction between I representations and E representations. Right? Where I representations are representations as work in semantic content, where the I can stand for internal or inferential, and the latter representations at work in co-varying with the environment, where the E can stand for external or environmental. And both are necessary, because an adequate theory requires both that we explain the content of our thoughts, beliefs, and assertions, as well as assuring that our thoughts are about the world. Now, although Price does not put the point quite this way, I think we can read him as saying that the myth of the given comes from failing to distinguish between the kind of cognitive capacities at work in discursive activities, what he calls the content assumption, and the kinds of cognitive capacities at work in tracking environmental regularities, what he calls the correspondence assumption. Now, I take it that Price accepts a roughly Brandomian account of the priority of inference for explaining propositional content, but that he wants to revive or return to Sellars' theory of picturing for the environment tracking kind of cognition, and this in turn is what licenses a partial rehabilitation of representationalism when it comes to E-representations. The thing to avoid is big R representationalism, and where one and the same content plays both roles. That's where you fall in the myth of the given. Now, I think that we can now see that, put more generally, the myth of the given arises when you conflate or confuse sentience and sapience. Sentience involves the world-directedness of cognitive processes. Sapience involves our intersubjective or communal correction of cognitive processes. Both are individually necessary and jointly sufficient for the kind of empirical content that we have. The difference between my solution and Price's is that Price avoids the myth by distinguishing between representations of sentience, the E representations, and representations of sapience, the I representations, whereas I aspire to avoid both kinds of representation by taking on board a much more thoroughgoing anti-representationalism about sentience through enactive cognition, as well as anti-representationalism about sapience through an inferential semantics. And if we can take on board enactive cognitive science in this way, we can dispense with the urge to smuggle representations back into the account of sentience after they've been dispensed with from the account of sapience. But insofar as pragmatism, in the long tradition from Dewey to Rorty, has long prided itself on its hostility to representationalism, but has not always been clear on the distinction between sentience and sapience, I take it that the synthesis, then, of inferentialism and enactivism is a viable possibility for a Sellarsian pragmatism in the 21st century. Thank you. So now you have plenty of time to tell me why I'm completely wrong.
Thank you very much. All right, I see first Ross, David. Wonderful. Yes.
So I'm completely on board with what you're doing here, and so this is neither a question nor a criticism, just a comment. It seems to me that the trouble with Wilfrid Sellars is that you end up with bottom up with propositional content, right? So this is a burden of the myth of the given. This is a burden of what Paul Coates uses, the subtraction argument. You end up with propositional content from the first person. And a thoroughgoing pragmatist theory of mind, a thoroughgoing enactivist embodied account would get rid of this propositional representational content, right? So I'm wondering whether, I think you're absolutely right, a Sellarsian approach is really good. I'm wondering whether it's Sellars Senior, not Sellars Junior, that we should be looking at here.
Well, yes. I mean, no. I mean, seriously. I mean, look. There's a lot in Roy. There's a lot in Roy Wood Sellars that is clearly quite congenial. That's really going to be quite important for making this work. There's this. I mean, I'm sure other people here can speak much more than I can to the precise relationship between the two Sellarses. I mean, is Roy Wood, could Roy Wood be a resource for me? Well, yes, absolutely. I guess I would have to read a lot more of Roy Wood's work in order to give you a better answer. But I guess I would maybe, we can talk about this at some point, I would like to know what I might be able to get from Roy Wood Sellars that I would not be getting from contemporary philosophers of biology, cognitive scientists. I mean, or so would there be something there, or is that just going to be sort of a fun footnote? I don't know. Don't know.
Thank you, Carl. That was a very rich talk and set up a large system with which I am less sympathetic than Ross is. But I don't think with something that's that articulated and intertwined, you're going to be able to just take down the whole thing with one simple criticism. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to poke at various places,
Okay.
offer a variety of what might look like small criticisms, and you respond to whichever ones you think are worth responding to. Right? Okay, so. One thing about connectionism and computationalism that I think doesn't get noted, and it's a fairly obvious thing that should get noted in these debates, is that no computationalist or connectionist has ever claimed that the neural network or the computational system is not embodied. It's of course embodied. It's going to be realized in the brain, but that brain is crucially connected to a body and to an environment. So I've always been puzzled by the contrast between the embodied and active versions, and as though the other ones are not embodied or inactive. This seems to me an odd contrast to have drawn. So that's one point where I don't see. I mean, for example, in a connectionist system, if you want to embody knowledge how or skills, which seem to be central to the account that you're offering, those are indeed embodied in the patterns of connections between the relevant nodes, and there's going to be some other implementation in the computationalist framework. But those things seem to be there, no less in the connectionist or computational versions than in the inactive approach. So that's one point of criticism. I'm not sure what the contrast is really supposed to be. It seems to me a little bit overblown. Another point of criticism is with regard to the way in which the apple appears to us in perception. This is another topic that kind of got you into this whole conversation or this discussion. And it seems to me just phenomenologically false that the apple appears to us in visual perception to have a white inside and a cool and juicy way. I mean, these are things that, of course, we know about the apple, having perceived it as an apple. And you're right that we don't perceive it as a surface-facing side, but that's because we apply the concept apple, and that's not merely us believing that it's an apple. It's a matter of the sensation, as Sellars put it, wrenching the concept apple from us. So I think this is most clearly seen when you consider other objects, not apples, like, for example, a dog. When I perceive my dog, I don't also perceive its viscera, its insides, its blood. These are not things that I of course can imagine that, I can conceptualize that, but that's not how I perceive my dog, I can assure you, right? And that brings me to a final point, which is, I mean, that example is something that Paul Coates does discuss in I think that Bill DeVries actually anthologized, where he brings in Kant's role of the productive imagination and the role it plays in perception. And he does try to find an embodied an element of embodiment in it, but he does it in a different way than you do. I think it's a more mild-mannered and, frankly, I think a more plausible way. Namely, that the productive imagination not only creates a sense-image model, but creates various imagined things that would happen were you to act upon the thing. So, for example, the imagination can construct a model of what would happen if you cut the apple, or for that matter, the dog. And so there are sort of bodily dispositions or behavioral dispositions built into the sense-image model that the productive imagination constructs. So you get the embodiment there. Though I'm not even sure that you need it, because sensations for Sellars are once again embodied. No. Sellars didn't claim that they were physical. He wasn't a Cartesian in that sense at all. So I don't know that we even need that much embodiment further built in from that. But even if you wanted some extra embodiment, it seems to me that Paul Coates' account doesn't go as far as yours does, in the sense that he's not claiming a radical reconstruction of our picture of the mind. We just add this little element into what the productive imagination does. It just also tells us about what would happen were we to behave towards the object in the relevant way. So those are some.
Okay, so thank you for that. So, for one thing, it is striking. I never actually thought that there is maybe a very serious problem with how, like the apple. I mean, like, you're right. No, that's not how I perceive my cats. Not usually, anyway. So there's that, right? And that's absolutely right. So I do need to think about what was Sellars. I mean, but, so then the question is, well, what was Sellars actually trying to get at, given that, and I think now look. And I framed the way I framed things here, I sort of framed my own approach as somewhat critical of Sellars. But to some extent, that is a rhetorical stance that I took, which I don't think was really necessary by the logic I'm arguing, but it seems to me, based on what you just said about Coates's work, one might just as easily say, well, here's the view, right? Sensor motor skills just are the productive imagination. Right, so that we don't need to, and the way you cashed out the productive imagination just now, using that bit from Coates, you say, well, that's just the know-how of the bodily dispositions, but of course that's what Noe says is at work as well. So it might be at the end of the day. I mean, and if there's not much distance between Coates and Noe, I'd have to look at Coates very hard to see. If there's no much distance between the two views, it's that they're just sort of appealing to different languages and different considerations, but there's not much difference, not much daylight between them, then maybe the view I really should say is, well, actually, Sellars is right. It just turns out that what the productive imagination really is this accumulated store of practical know-how about the relevant sensory-motor contingencies. On the first point you started with, right, I mean, look, no, you're right, that maybe some of the inactive stuff gets a little bit overblown, but I think there's a real difference between saying, well, you've got the cognitive processes that are sort of going on in the brain, and then, yeah, the body is just sort of there as an instrument through which those processes get implemented or become constantly efficacious, versus saying that bodily encounters with the environment actually constitute or partly constitute cognitive activities. So even if the rhetoric gets overblown in what the analogists are trying to say, I still think there's a real difference there between, just the implementation or the realization of whatever, or just treating the sense organs as sort of part of the input-output system, versus thinking that, how we bodily encounter our environments at least partially constitutes at least some cognitive processes. And I say at least some because I do want to hedge my bets, So, is there a really good enactivist account of, say, mathematics? I don't know. Certainly it seems, I know people think they have one. Is it good? I don't know. It seems certainly at least difficult to see how just sort of, what's the role of embodiment in, the conceiving of different orders of infinity. It's hard to see what the embodiment is there, right? But at least some. That's why I say at least some. But yeah, but I think there is a difference there. Thank you.
We have two questions here.
Hi. In Science and Metaphysics, Sellars uses a notion of intellectual intuition in Kant, and he uses it to bolster Sellars' own view that there's a type of intuition that's conceptual in nature. And whether the Kantian notion of intellectual intuition is conceptual in the way that Kant or Sellars says it is debatable. But what we have to do, I think, is to distinguish intellectual intuition from divine understanding. And divine understanding in Kant is active in the sense that God's intuition, if you like, of something creates the thing at the time. In other words, God doesn't need receptivity. Consequently, when God understands, the understanding produces the thing that's understood. Whereas when it comes to intellectual intuition, that's still passive in nature. Now, if you're going to use intellectual intuition to say, look, this is going to bolster my Sellars notion of intuition as involving concepts, the idea of passivity is still there in intellectual intuition. And consequently, for me, it would still be there in this notion of intuition that Sellars is producing as well. Could you comment on that?
Well, can I comment on that? I can try and sort of think. I'm sort of trying to think through what the claim is here. So, is the claim that intuition? Is the claim that I still need some moment of passivity in the conception of intuition here? I mean, is
Yes.
okay. That was easy. Well, okay. Well, yes, of course. Well, that's right. And I mean, of course, it'd be a moment of passivity or constraint. I mean, that's just, reflection on the nature of finitude, of our human finitude. Right. So that's clearly right. My point, though, is that we can also that we can still sort of make a distinction between. My point, rather, is that the distinction between spontaneity and receptivity does not have to just correspond to the distinction between activity and passivity, but rather we can have a much more complex picture in which both spontaneity and receptivity both have a dimension of activity as well as passivity. So I'm not trying to say, oh, there's no passivity in intuition. I'm not saying that. That would be crazy. Thank you, though.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of stuff in there that I thought was really interesting and that I don't know a lot about. So I hope you'll forgive if the sketchy reconstruction of one of the threads in there that I'm about to give is oversimplified and probably inaccurate. But I wanted to defend a little bit on behalf of Mark and Rebecca against what I thought I picked up on as a kind of, if not dualism, since that's sort of a slur, distinction or a difference that's sharper than I think they want it to be.
Okay.
If I'm reading it right. So it sounds like the constraint that you talk about, the sensory motor skills offering on our cognition, is going to be causal constraint, since the sensory motor system is you described it as the causal instantiation of a transcendental structure. And you also said that it needs to have a different set or different kind of concepts from the ones involved in propositional content. And I'm not sure why that is. It sounds like you want that because you think we need it to avoid the myth of the given. So I think what the Super Squirrels paper is supposed to be doing is vindicating some of the frustratingly metaphorical talk in McDowell of objects getting a grip on us and enchantment of nature. But the thought there is he wants to resist the merely causal encroachment of the world on our cognitive processes. And so what I think they want to do with it, they being Mark and Rebecca, to maybe just borrow a couple slogans, why don't we just say they're the same concepts? They are the ones in use in our propositional content are making explicit the ones that are already implicit in sensory motor conceptual dealings or coping. And the reason that there's no problem of givenism is that our ability to take the concepts that are at work in our sensory motor dealings and make them explicit in propositional content involves the actualization of a distinctively rational capacity that's a feature of our second nature. So they're not given. It requires a learned capacity that's being actualized in making them explicit. And this can kind of bring these two systems closer together where we don't have sensory motor concepts that causally constrain a different kind of concepts. That sounds like it's more like what I take it Mark and Rebecca want to do, and I'm not sure why you're not going all that going the whole way there with it.
Okay. So actually, in the middle, while you were in the middle of framing that criticism, I actually realized that I have been making a fairly serious blunder all this time. So thank you for the inspiration. Because all this time, I've been thinking that there have to be two different kinds of concepts in order to understand the distinction between the minds of rational animals and the minds of non-rational animals. And that's, of course, I still think that. But I just realized, for some reason, I have always thought that somehow the kinds of concepts that non-rational animals have are sort of also at work in the minds of us rational animals at the same time. So the two kinds of concepts are sitting side by side. But then I realized I have no idea why I thought that.
That's the additive conceptual rationality that McDowell.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe I need to really rethink this, and maybe if I thought more about how the initiation into a language replaces or sort of puts in place a different kind of concept, so you don't have the different kinds, then maybe I would just see, so maybe I would see that Mark and Rebecca are just right. I don't need to be critical of them in the way that I thought I was. Okay, well, I've got more work to do.
Okay, thanks for your talk. I agree that Sellars, and this is actually kind of related to the previous question, I think Sellars does need an account of how sheer receptivity does any constraining. And I agree that he seems to suggest that it's got to be causal in nature, the way it does that. Maybe sensory motor skills are a good candidate, but I think before we can even start to assess that, we need to look at some of these other questions, especially the kinds of worries that, say, McDowell does raise, right? So there's the famous Woodbridge lectures by McDowell, where he criticizes Sellars for this very thing, right? He says that there's this real problem about how sheer receptivity, which is, he draws this line. He's always talking about below the line, above the line.
Right.
The line is what's in the logical space of reasons, that's above the line, and what's not in that space is below the line. So sheer receptivity clearly is below. And, right, so the problem is, for him, anything that's not in that space, anything that's below the line, but that's also doing some kind of constraining, that has some kind of, in some epistemic force of its own, independently of any role it might play above the line, that's givenness. And so this, I take it to be a fairly forceful criticism of what Sellars was trying to do in those opening chapters of Science and Metaphysics, to which, if we're trying to fix Sellars here, we would also have to show how he can escape these kinds of criticisms, and I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on that.
Okay. So, there's nothing I can say about McDowell that's going to be brief. Let me just sort of put it this way. The distinction between sentience and sapience is itself a transcendental distinction. That's itself a distinction that we are making when we engage in a certain kind of reflection. Now, it might be that McDowell just doesn't care about cognitive science, or doesn't think that cognitive science is relevant to epistemology and philosophy of mind. That's fine. He can have that view. I simply disagree. I think it's very much relevant. Now, and I think in part, I think it's going to be, I've sort of had to prepare a much longer answer about why exactly is relevant in response to McDowell. But I think that, I think that the problem, one of the problems that McDowell actually ends up with is, he just sort of thinks, we have to have, in order to reject myth of the given, everything that we're doing when we do philosophy per se has to be done entirely at the conceptual level. But the way his thought evolves, he ends up in the 2009 paper distinguishing between discursive conceptual content and intuitional conceptual content. And I guess I sort of feel that when you get to a point where you're, first of all, that itself is just going to be a Sellarsian, that's already the Sellarsian distinction.
He takes it from Sellars. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right.
And, why don't we need receptivity? I mean, McDowell just seems to think, well, we don't need it because, then we're sort of ruining the purity of philosophy by taking science too seriously or something like that. I know I'm being unfair. I'm a little bit tired.
You're right. It's a big problem. So.
It's a big problem, yeah.
But there was an attempt to bridge this gap when you talk about guidedness, because it was always interesting. I can't hear you. Sorry? It's just not working?
They could turn.
There was an attempt. I mean, I've always been interested in that term guidedness.
Yeah.
And there was an attempt, and the attempt was to use what were called unconscious inferences.
Mm-hmm.
And I never understood that.
Mm-hmm.
And recently I've had occasion to talk to people who are talking this way. Unconscious inferences will do this. I don't understand how that works.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of anybody going?
I'm afraid not, no.
It's because I'm going back to the late 19th century with this. And,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, there was an attempt to bridge this gap between what was pure receptivity and then the conceptual realm.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought people like Helmholtz had done this. I never understood it.
Preston.
This is just on the thought of unconscious inferences. So it struck me, this is an example, so it may be worth nothing more than just the anecdote. But I was on an airplane a number of years ago, and I was sort of drifting off to sleep, and I looked out the window, and I could see a shape go by, and I couldn't tell whether it was a cloud or a lake, and I was sort of curious. But I was in that hazy period between being asleep and being awake, and suddenly I knew it was a cloud. And I wondered, how did I know? And then I woke up, and I thought about it, and it was because of parallax. It was because it was moving relative to the plane too fast to be on the ground. And I mean, I don't know what to make of that, but it seems like it was something was going on cognitively that was putting those impressions together so as to make a judgment, but it wasn't conscious until I thought about it. So.
Jazz.
Thank you.
Hi, really enjoyed that talk. I was just curious if maybe, since I enjoyed it so much, I don't really have a criticism or anything as much as just a curiosity of maybe a systemic or systematic exploration of how this connects to other themes in Sellars. So I'm curious, you entered in on the kind of the Kantian, with the Kantian essay, historical, but I'm curious how this connects with the orientation system stuff, and specifically, I'm curious, something that kind of made me think maybe there's another connection here is in the same way that he uses in mental events propositions as an analogy to talk about animal representation systems. Maybe that's how you can understand this two concept thing that you're working with, insofar as we understand this kind of sensory motor things as you can understand them as concepts analogously to how we have concepts in an intentional way. I don't know if that gets you out of the dualism problem or not, but so those things, just like a kind of just a general systemic question.
Yeah, so the bit about animal representation systems, or what Sachs calls orientation systems, right? I have not thought enough about how to relate what I'm trying to do with Noe and Thompson to that material. But, and one thing, and it's, a lot of us have a sort of love-hate relationship with picturing, right? Which is part by, the way the mapping and the ARSs get described in that essay, right? I mean, that's a way to sort of attempt to sort of flesh out picturing in a certain way. I might end up taking the view, and I don't even know if I want to do this or not, but I'm at least experimenting, toying with the idea that the structural coupling between sensor motor abilities and environmental affordances is picturing. That might be a really dumb idea, and I hope somebody here will tell me so at some point, although hopefully politely. That's dumb.
Thank you.
I don't anticipate anyone's going to tell you you have any dumb ideas today. I want to thank you so much.